Lovelian's fierce expression instantly transformed. It had turned back into the appearance of the kind young man who had said hello children with a smile on his face during the bloodline continuation ceremony 4 years ago. It's been a long time, Eugene, Lovelian nodded respectfully. Although his smiling face was the same as back then, the tone of his voice had changed. This was because Eugene's station had also changed over the years. 4 years ago, Eugene was just one of the several children from common collateral branches. However, the current Eugene was now the adopted son of the Lionheart's direct line. You've grown a lot, Lovelian observed. Ha ha, to be honest, I almost didn't recognize you. Master Lovelian hasn't changed at all, Eugene complimented the man. Well, so what? It's just because I'm holding on to my youth with my magic. After all, isn't it better to have a youthful appearance than an aged one? As Lovelian descended to the ground, he gave Eugene a broad smile. From what Eugene had heard, Lovelian was close to 100 years old. However, he looked like he was in his mid-20s at most. Although he seems different from when I saw him 4 years ago. Even then, he had gotten a vague, sort of threatening feeling from Lovelian. But because he hadn't started training his mana sensitivity yet, he hadn't been able to confirm anything as he was unable to sense the man's mana. However, now that Eugene had met Lovelian once more, he now knew for sure. Lovelian was strong. This was actually rather appropriate. As one of Aerith's 5 tower masters, he should at least have that level of strength. However, Eugene didn't feel any other sort of impression from Lovelian, just that he was strong. When Eugene recalled the strong men he had met in his previous life, the ones he immediately thought of were those who had given him a unique impression besides their strength. It looks like he has a long way to go before reaching Sienna's level, Eugene observed. Lovelian also examined Eugene in turn. This is absurd. Lovelian was astonished at the amount of mana he sensed from Eugene. It was Lovelian who had suggested that Eugene be adopted. He had already noticed Eugene's potential during the bloodline continuation ceremony. Even after returning to Aeroth, he had kept in touch with Gilead and had heard all about Eugene's accomplishments. He had heard about how Eugene could sense mana in less than 10 minutes after entering the ley line. That was an abnormal level of mana sensitivity. Not only that, but Eugene had also shown monstrous levels of mana affinity that had allowed him to control the mana as soon as he sensed it. Lovelian couldn't help but feel troubled whenever he heard these stories about Eugene. Of course, this was because of Eward. Eventually, Lovelian said, I've heard the news from Gilead. So, you are interested in magic? Yes, sir, Eugene confirmed. Magic is an extremely engaging field of study, although it's just as difficult to learn as it is interesting. But if it's you, Eugene, you should be able to do well. As he muttered this, Lovelian turned his head. He could feel a presence from behind the closed door that barred the entrance to the tower's first floor. He didn't feel comfortable with how this presence was just lingering there, not daring to open the door. With a click of his tongue, Lovelian shot the door a glance. Creak! The closed door swung open, immediately followed by a sound of gasp. It had come from a skinny young man who was visibly taken aback when the door suddenly opened. It was Eward Lionheart. Eugene wasn't able to recognize him immediately. After all, 4 years was an exceptionally long time for children. Eward had grown a lot taller. However, his physique hadn't grown to match his new height. Eugene glanced at Eward's barely muscled limbs. He also noted Eward's dull, spiritless eyes. As for his gray hair, which could be called a symbol of the Lionheart clan along with their sigil, it looked as dry and lifeless as withered blades of grass. That fucking bastard! Eugene's eyes began to burn with an inner fire as he looked at Eward. With an appearance like that, he's practically bragging about how he's regularly getting his life force sucked away by succubi. Lovelian chided Eward. Shouldn't you at least come out to greet your younger brother? Lovelian chided Eward. Shouldn't you at least come out to greet your younger brother? Ahem. With an awkward cough, Eward looked up at Eugene. I'm not quite sure what I should say. It's nice to meet you, big brother. Eugene put some force into his voice as he glared at Eward. Let's get along well from now on. Hey, all right. Eward nodded in agreement as he avoided meeting Eugene's intense gaze. Then, being careful not to draw Lovelian's ire, Eward slowly began backing away. What do you even think you're doing? If you have nothing else to do, go upstairs and at least read a book. Lovelian spat out this order as he turned his gaze away from Eward. if it wasn't for the fact that Eward was a scion of the Lionheart clan's direct line, and if it hadn't been a request from his old friend Gilead, Lovelian would have never allowed Eward to remain in his tower. It had already been several years since Lovelian had begun experiencing this internal conflict between his friendship with Gilead and his desire to expel Eward. Yes, sir. Eward crept away with his shoulders slumped. Without looking at the wretched appearance of Eward's receding figure, Lovelian let out a long sigh. Really now? Please accept my regrets for showing you such shameful sights as soon as you've arrived, Lovelian apologized. Eugene accepted the apology. Don't worry, it's fine. As for that earlier commotion, well, as Hiraha told you, it's quite a common incident for the Red Tower of Magic. Though a serious disturbance like today's is rare. As Lovelian smiled bitterly, he shot a glance at Hira and said, So Elv heard from Gilead that you are unwilling to receive personal lessons in magic from me. Eugene explained, It's just that I don't want to burden you unnecessarily, head wizard. 1. That's fine with me. But I just hope that you live up to my expectation. Eugene, Lovelian admitted. Lovelian appreciated Eugene's explanation. Although he had already realized this 4 years ago, the boy in front of him showed a depth of consideration that belied his age. Though rather than consideration, would it be better to call it calculation? Lovelian mused to himself. This wasn't an easy judgment to make. Lovelian didn't know much about Eugene, nor had they spent much time together. Well, it was fine either way. It was better to be overly considerate than to be shameless despite your lacking ability, and it was better to be calculating than to be greedy and stupid. I'm not fully confident that I will be able to live up to your expectations, Eugene replied as he took a step back. Waving a sword, thrusting a spear, swinging an axe. These are the things that I'm most confident in. From a young age, I was sure that I had a talent for these. But magic is a field of study that I have absolutely no experience with, so I don't dare to say that I have the talent for it. These words also appealed to Lovelian. It showed that Eugene's mentality was much better than Eward's, who lacked both motivation and effort. Eugene continued his explanation. Also, if I personally learn magic from Master Lovelian, many people will look at the Lionheart clan with dissatisfaction. So, for the time being, I would like to study the field of magic on my own. Very well. Then let's do it like that. Lovelian nodded his agreement with a warm smile. Unless you ask me to. Eugene, I will not interfere with your studies. However, since it will be hard for a beginner to begin studying the field of magic all alone, if you ever need help, feel free to ask me for assistance at any time. Yes, sir. Have you arranged for a place to stay? No, I haven't found one yet. In that case, just stay in the tower. It might not be as luxurious as the main family's mansion, but it's an adequate place to live. Is it okay for me to move in right away? There's no reason why you shouldn't. At Lovelian's cheerful answer, Eugene also smiled broadly. Eugene had hoped that he would be able to stay in the tower. That was why he hadn't even gone looking for a place to stay beforehand. Eugene asked, If that's the case, would it be all right if I take a look at the library first? 1. Tower Master and Head Wizard are both used for the same position of Tower Master. They are sometimes used alternately, specifically when addressing the person in question. Adding this note, in case any of you are confused why Eugene is addressing Lovelian as the Head Wizard. Today as well. Why on earth is a rich young master like him doing something like that? Who knows why he would come all the way to Aeroth just to do that? From what I've heard, even the main family has recognized his talent. Isn't he just trying to attract attention by doing that? As a young master of the Lionhearts, he can attract everyone's attention just by standing there. Why would he feel the need to put on a show like that? It could be possible. After all, he's only from a collateral line, not a potential heir. The young wizards who were currently gathered in the library disliked Eugene. Unlike them, who had entered the Red Tower of Magic after a difficult series of exams, Eugene had been granted entry into the tower just on the virtue of his name as a Lionheart. But they couldn't express their dissatisfaction directly. Openly criticizing Eugene was the same as criticizing Lovelian, the Tower Master. Still, isn't he at least better than that fool, Eward? Don't even think of comparing the two. Of course, he's better than Eward. At least this juvenile young master is actually working hard. Even among these young wizards, many were able to recognize the admirable qualities that a person possessed, despite disliking that person. As they puffed on their cigarettes, the wizards kept glancing at the library's top floor. On that floor, the seat facing the window was practically Eugene's exclusive spot, as he'd been the only one using it for the past month. Of course, it wasn't actually reserved for him, but after Eugene had taken that seat, no one else had dared to sit there. At first, quite a few wizards had approached him with fake smiles. They had all been people who were interested in Eugene's family name, Lionheart. By getting close to the young 17-year-old boy, they were hoping to make connections with the Lionheart clan. But of course, Eugene had disregarded such attempts. Isn't the weather today quite pleasant? Isn't that the beginner's guide to magic? Man, I also began learning magic using that book when I was young. If it's all right with you, how about I teach you a bit of magic? Doesn't it get boring spending the whole day inside the library? Young master, since the weather's so nice, why don't we take a walk together? I know a really good restaurant. Whenever these sorts approached, Eugene always gave the same response. I'm fine. Since they were always met with the exact same reply no matter what, at some point, these wizards had stopped approaching Eugene, and he was perfectly okay with that. No one would sit near him, so his surroundings were always empty, and on top of the wide desk, the books that Eugene had selected formed several towers circling him. Inside this enclosed space, the only sound that could be heard was that of pages turning. Although there was a smoking area directly below him, only a few floors down, the cigarette smoke didn't rise this high thanks to the magic that partitioned each floor. Due to that, Eugene could concentrate on reading while breathing in the fresh air. It had already been a month since he had come to the Red Tower of Magic. Without skipping a single day, Eugene had visited the library daily. He was in the library from early in the morning and only returned to his room when it was late at night. He wasn't just spending all his time on magic. He woke up a few hours before he needed to head to the library each day to train his mana, and before going to sleep, he worked out until he was pouring with sweat. Although this reduced his time spent sleeping, Eugene's gifted body was able to shake off all his fatigue after just a few hours of sleep. With the assistance of mana on top of that, he wouldn't feel more than a little tired, even if he missed a few days of sleep. Yawn. The sun was slowly setting. Eugene glanced up at the last rays of sunset shining through the window. After staring out the window for a few moments, Eugene got up from his seat. He gathered the books strewn across the desk and returned them to their original places. There was no aimless wandering, as Eugene clearly remembered where each book had come from. Not only did he recall their original locations, but Eugene had also memorized the contents of each book he had read. Just by lightly retracing his memory, he was easily able to recall everything he had seen on their pages. Despite initially having a poor grasp of magic, Eugene had begun to increasingly understand the field of magic with each book he read. Even this head of mine proves innately talented. With a grin, Eugene headed down the stairs. In just a month, he had read all the introductory texts of magic that were stored in the Red Tower of Magic's library. At first, the books had been so confusing that it had even been painful to just turn the pages. But the more he had read, the more it all began to make sense. And later on, he had even been able to understand the contents of a book just by skimming over it. Although I'm still only at the theory level for now. For the past month, Eugene had only been reading books. While this had filled in the holes in his knowledge, he had yet to properly begin practicing magic. He had his reasons. Although it was all lumped together as magic, magic actually came in an infinite variety of forms. The more books he had read in the library, the more Eugene had begun to worry about which method would best suit his body. That was why he had only focused on reading books. But now I don't have anything more to read. It went without saying that any wizard who had joined the Red Tower had already achieved public recognition of their skills. So the introductory books on magic provided by the tower weren't meant to be actually used by any of the wizards in the tower and were instead prepared so that the wizards could use them for research and reference. In other words, they were all famous magical texts that had received public recognition for their reliability. Although there were countless introductory books on magic in the world, if you had read all the introductory texts in the tower, there was no need to read any other introductory text. Now then, shall I give it a go? As Eugene approached the library's front desk, he spoke up. I would like to make the attempt today. The librarian sitting at the desk raised her head to look up at Eugene and said, "It's about time." The librarian was Hera, the wizard Eugene had met on the first day he had arrived at the tower. While the wizards of the tower were usually immersed in the research that they were currently pursuing, Hera had recently finished a research project and was relaxing while working as a librarian. Lovelian had told Eugene to ask him for advice if he had any questions about magic, but it would be bothersome and awkward for Eugene to approach Lovelian with every trivial question he might have. "If you have any questions, feel free to ask me." Perhaps Hera had also noticed this, as she was the first to approach Eugene and make this offer. Thanks to this, during the past month that Eugene had stayed at the tower, he had received help from her several times and had even gotten to know her quite well. "Where would you like to do it?" Hera asked. "I'd like to use the basement laboratory," Eugene answered. "Please wait one moment. Another librarian should be arriving soon to take over," Hera said as she began tidying up her desk. While waiting for the replacement librarian, Eugene categorized the magical techniques floating around inside his head. Many wizards had purchased residences outside the tower, but most young wizards stayed within the rooms provided by the tower. This went for Eugene as well. Although he had access to a lot of money, living in the tower was much more convenient than buying or renting a residence. Perhaps because the tower had been used to research summoning magic for so long, there were many different types of familiars taking care of the daily chores inside the tower. The rooms were a lot smaller than the annex's rooms at the main estate. Still, they were spacious enough to comfortably live in by yourself, and Eugene was satisfied with them. There was also no need to go to a restaurant. As long as you told them in advance, the familiars would bring the dishes that you ordered up to your room. If he was forced to pick something that he was dissatisfied with, it would be the lack of a gymnasium. But that still wasn't a deal breaker, as one of the many laboratories could substitute for a gymnasium. The only annoying thing was that, since the laboratories on each of the tower floors were reserved for high-ranking wizards, he needed to take an elevator down to the basement to use the laboratory there. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Hera said once she was ready to go. Hera was wearing her large pointed hat today as well. He had wondered if the style from 300 years ago was back in fashion, but it had turned out that Hera's tastes were just a bit unusual. Hera was the only one in the tower who insisted on wearing such stereotypical wizard's clothing. "It looks like my brother hasn't shown up today either," Eugene noted. "Well, that's just how it is sometimes," Hera said with a bitter smile as she put on her large wizard's hat. For the first week following Eugene's arrival at the tower, Ewart had also visited the library, but only for that first week. After that, Eugene rarely saw Ewart in the library, and it was even rarer to see him in the hallways. He had heard that Ewart had been like this for the past few years. No matter how friendly Lovelian was with Gilead, Ewart's skill fell far too short of the standard for Lovelian to take him as his disciple. It was, of course, for the sake of fairness, but Lovelian also could not risk tarnishing his reputation as the tower master. As such, Lovelian had arranged for an idle high-ranking wizard who belonged to the tower to become Ewart's teacher. Not only had he allowed Ewart to enter the tower, but Lovelian had also managed to secure him a skilled teacher, so Lovelian had gone above and beyond what his friendship with Gilead accounted for. But Ewart remained a problem. After coming to the Red Tower of Magic, Ewart had worked hard for about half a year. But after a certain point, he had stopped frequenting the library or the laboratories and instead loitered in his room or outside the tower. Pathetic bastard. Eugene knew the reason for this. 3 years ago, Ewart had taken the recruitment test for the Towers of Magic at Lovelian's suggestion. The results hadn't been great. Although he got a pretty decent grade for his theoretical, Ewart's results in the practicals were so terrible that they couldn't be excused. Due to this, the situation had become awkward and embarrassing, not just for Lovelian, but also for all the other wizards who had taught Ewart. If he's not good enough, he should work even harder. How long does he plan on playing around while living off his family's money? On top of that, he's even become a succubus's life force one meal ticket. If he had personally witnessed the scene of Ewart being fed on by a succubus, Eugene would have beaten up Ewart without any care for the fact that Ewart was his older brother, or that he was an heir of the Lionheart clan. Ewart might be feeling cautious because of Eugene, as he had stayed quietly locked up in the tower on the previous night of the full moon. However, he wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. A few days ago, Eugene had run into Ewart in one of the tower's many corridors. Although his pale skin and dry hair had appeared to be rejuvenated, he was constantly biting his fingernails, and his eyes were clouded. These were signs of withdrawal. It was apparent that Eward would probably go looking for his succubus on the next full moon. As they were heading down to the basement in the elevator, having offered to supply enough of the mana needed to move the elevator for the both of them, Hera spoke up. I expect that you're going to be attempting to use the circle's magic formula, correct? Yep, Eugene confirmed. One of the reasons why the wise Sienna was so revered in Aeroth was because she had systematically established a ranking for the different levels of magical aptitude. 300 years ago, the line that separated a good wizard from a great one was still very vague. Powerful and astonishing spells obviously required a lot of mana, so a good wizard must be one who knew how to freely handle enormous amounts of mana. But the way in which they cast their spells also needed to be appropriately difficult and complex. In other words, a good wizard must be someone who was able to control a lot of mana and cast many different spells. This wasn't incorrect. But if you wanted to be called an archwizard, it was obvious that not only did you need to know how to cast many different types of magic, but you also needed to be proficient in casting spells so complex that no other wizard would be able to copy you. 300 years ago, Sienna created clear divisions between the different stages of magical aptitude. Strictly speaking, Sienna had only devised this system for her own use, but after she became the Green Tower Master, Aeroth's numerous wizards began adopting her system of magic. Sienna's system was based on the Circle system of magic. This system involved guiding the mana inside the body into a circular flow, and then allowing this flow to draw out the mana from within the body when a spell was cast. As the amount of mana that a wizard could control increased, their circle of mana became thicker and stronger. When the amount of mana controlled exceeded what a single circle could handle, the number of circles increased, and these circles were able to overlap with each other. Furthermore, each time the number of circles increased, the amount of mana that could be incorporated into a spell multiplied exponentially, so even a simple spell could have different power levels depending on the number of circles used to cast it. 300 years had passed since then, and now most wizards were first introduced to magic through the Circle's magic formula. The only ones who weren't started on circles were those who specialized in spirit magic and black magic, as these two forms of magic made use of different magical systems. Well, it's not like there's any other choice. Although there are other magic formulas besides the Circle's magic formula, over these past 300 years, the Circles have proven to be the most effective and logical system of magic, Hera said with a prideful expression on her face. Lovelian wasn't the only one who claimed to be a follower of Sienna. All wizards who used the Circles as their foundational magic formula claimed Sienna as their master. The Red Tower of Magic and the Green Tower of Magic were particularly proud of this heritage. I'm considering trying to change things up a bit. As the elevator arrived at the basement laboratory, Eugene was the first to step off as he admitted these words. Although I'm unsure yet if it will work. You're going to make some changes. That's not really. It doesn't seem like a good idea, Hera commented with a worried expression as she followed Eugene out. Circle adaptation is a research topic that all wizards have tried to investigate at least once. However, Sir Eugene, you haven't even taken your first steps into magic yet. Wouldn't it be better to start with the orthodox method first, and then study how to adapt the circles after you've reached a certain level? Despite all these objections, it wasn't because she thought he was a pretentious child. Hera was genuinely concerned for Eugene. Magic formulas were just as difficult to adapt as they were to create. If he ran out of mana during the attempt, then the magic formula could collapse within him. This could result in him being unable to use mana for the rest of his life or even death. Even if the consequences weren't that dire, he would still be bedridden for several days. Eugene attempted to reassure Hera. Well, it's not like I'm going to tear it apart and redo it from the very start. I promise that it won't be that dangerous. If it's okay with you, may I please hear what you're planning to do? Hera insisted. I'm planning on combining the circles with the Lionheart's mana formula, Eugene replied without any obfuscation. At these words, Hera was left blinking in shock for a few moments. Could there be something off with his real age? Hera couldn't help but give this thought some consideration. She was well aware that Eugene was so precocious that it was hard to believe he was only 17. However, after hearing what was just said, Hera felt a sense of incongruity when she thought about his age. Sir Eugene, The mana system used for martial arts and the mana system used for magic are two different paths. Although I don't know much about the Lionheart clan's mana formula, does it at least incorporate any concepts related to magical operations or incantations? Hira questioned patiently. No, it doesn't, Eugene admitted. Hira started to lecture him. If that's the case, it should be impossible to use the Lionheart clan's mana system to cast magic. Although you'll be able to draw out the mana for the spell, unless you shape it according to the principles of magic and trigger it with an incantation, you won't be able to produce any magical phenomena. That's why I'd like to test combining the two systems, Eugene insisted despite obediently listening to Hera's advice. Eugene wasn't sure that it would definitely work as planned. He had actually asked himself several times, could this really work? But something was telling him that it was possible. To verify this hunch, he had first read all the introductory texts on magic that were stored in the library. It won't be all that dangerous, Eugene repeated. Hira finally conceded. For now, why don't you give it a shot? However, if the mana flow seems dangerous, I will be ready to intervene immediately. If you get injured, Sir Eugene, it won't just be me who gets in trouble. The Tower Master will also find himself in a precarious position. Yes, ma'am. Eugene nodded and came to a halt in front of a door. There were actually a lot of laboratories down here in the deep basement of the tower. Having picked the same laboratory that he'd been using over the past month, Eugene opened the door. The inside of the laboratory was extremely spacious. Thanks to advanced space distortion magic, this basement could contain dozens of laboratories of this size. Although he had felt quite surprised on his first day here, Eugene was now able to calmly stand in the center of the laboratory. 1. His vitality is the energy that the succubus feeds on for nourishment. I'll be starting now, Eugene declared. All right, Hira acknowledged. Hira couldn't hide the anxious look in her eyes. She quietly summoned her staff and gripped it with both hands. This was so that she could respond immediately in case of an emergency. Eugene was relaxed. It really is similar to the white flame formula. He was thinking about the circles. As a system of magic created by Sienna, Eugene was indeed interested in it. Although the two were different systems, they shared the same essence. The white flame formula guided mana into the stars around his heart. The circles guided mana into a circular flow. In the white flame formula, whenever there was enough growth, another star split off. With the circles, whenever there was enough growth, another circle was formed. I just have to try and apply them together. It all made sense to him. Eugene had a good understanding of both methods, and he was personally familiar with the white flame formula. As for the mana control that was needed, he'd been continuously refining that ever since his previous life. Although he wasn't sure if it would work, Eugene felt that it was worth a try. The circles can be replaced with the stars. The resonance between the stars can amplify the mana. Depending on the situation, I'll have to make instantaneous adjustments to the mana. It'll be a pain if I mispredict it and make a mistake. This was no ordinary magic formula. Within moments, he could end up drained of all his mana. However, Eugene didn't hesitate. The mana within his body gathered to his heart. The three stars began to shine and then resonate as they linked up with each other. No way, Hira, who was holding on tightly to her staff, let out a noise of disbelief. Not only could she feel how pure the mana that Eugene had drawn out from his core was, but she could also tell how powerful it was. So this was the descendant of the great Vermouth, the man known as the god of war and the master of all. The whole world had heard of how impressive the Lionheart clan's mana training scripture was. However, wasn't this going a bit too far? How could a 17-year-old youth like Eugene possibly draw out such pure and vast quantities of mana? Slowly, Eugene reminded himself. Efuash. A pure white flame engulfed his entire body. Eugene focused his concentration as he adjusted the flow of mana. He needed to be conscious of his current limits in controlling his mana, as he couldn't afford to overdo it. Eugene believed that this was possible because he felt something like this was no different from producing sword light or sword force. But now, how should he manifest this mana into a spell? From the depths of Eugene's memory, he recalled a specific method of processing the spell's form. Incantations didn't necessarily need to be spoken out loud. The important thing was to have a clear will to trigger the effect of a spell. His mana surged up, but Eugene suppressed it. He continued to adjust the unruly strands of mana. The experience from his previous life gave Eugene as much mana control as he needed. He has such perfect mana control. It keeps looking like it's about to unravel, but it all stays together. Doesn't that mean he's controlling even the smallest particles of mana? Is that even possible at his age? Hera asked herself. The more mana you attempt to control, the weaker your grip on it. That was just common sense. Mana control required not just talent, but a lot of experience as well. It was only 4 years ago that Eugene Lionheart, as a collateral descendant, had first initiated his mana. But he was able to accumulate so much mana in just these 4 years and attain perfect control over his mana as well. That was just absurd. Right now, Eugene's mana was so pure and strong that Eward, who had initiated his mana when he was only 5 years old, couldn't even compare to him. I did hear he was a monster, Hera recalled what Lovelian had told her about Eugene. However, Lovelian wasn't her only source of rumors regarding Eugene. The bloodline continuation ceremony was a famous tradition of the Lionheart clan. During the 300 years of the bloodline continuation ceremony's continued existence, there was only one occasion where a collateral descendant had defeated those from the direct line. Eugene was the only one who had ever qualified to be adopted into the main family through this method. As this incident became widely known, the world had begun to call the still 13-year-old Eugene a monster. Efuash. A sphere of flames had appeared in front of Eugene. While staring into it, Eugene slowly began separating the sphere into strands in order to reform it into another spell. He could not allow the mana to completely dissipate and thus disappear, so all his focus was directed toward his mana. The scattered strands of flame began to coalesce once more. Sweat dripped from his forehead and ran down to the end of his chin before falling to the ground. The shape of the coalescing flames had completely changed from the previous sphere. From the first circle's basic spell, the fireball, it had been converted into another first circle spell, the magic missile. Eugene stared at the completed magic missile floating in front of him. Honestly speaking, it was easier and stronger to just send out a ray of swordlight than it was to go through such trouble for a single magic missile. Or else, he could just summon a spirit of the wind. Either way, it would have been stronger than this clumsy first attempt and much more convenient and familiar to the current Eugene. However, Eugene smiled in satisfaction. Wasn't this a good result for his first attempt? Although the spell wasn't powerful enough to justify the effort put into it, being able to use magic like this was enough to make Eugene happy. Because I never got to learn magic in my previous life. The truth was that Sienna had actually suggested that he learn magic from her several times. If you really want to, I could teach you some magic. Don't need it. But Vermouth is great at magic. Don't you want to use magic like Vermouth does? I can't surpass Vermouth in the things that I already know how to do. So won't the difference between us just increase if I act like a know-it-all and start trying to learn magic as well? And also, do you have the confidence to teach me magic that will allow me to beat Vermouth ragged? And seriously, Sienna, it's not like you're better at magic than Vermouth, right? Do you want to die? Don't compare me to something like him. Does it really make sense to compare Vermouth, who's as good at fighting as he is at using magic, to me, who only knows how to use magic? I can't use magic, and I'm good at fighting, but I'm still not a better fighter than Vermouth. That's because you're an idiot. I am better at using magic than Vermouth. It's just, well, we have different specialties. That's it. It would have been helpful if he had just obediently taken the lessons at that time. Well, fuck, it's not like I knew that I would be reincarnated. If he had known that he would be reincarnated, he would definitely have worked hard to learn magic from Sienna. Eugene grinned and tried to move the magic missile around. Although it was slightly clumsy, it gave him a different feeling from when he used the pure mana generated by the white flame formula. It's also different from swordlight. As he considered this, Eugene began to restore his mana through the breathing method. Hera, who had been watching all this with dazed eyes, said, You really are amazing." Even though she had seen it all with her own eyes, she still couldn't quite believe it. Hera alternated between staring at the sweat-drenched Eugene and the magic missile held in front of him. For a month, he only read the introductory text on magic, and this is his first time actually casting a spell. Even if he had learned mana control before this, the mana used in martial arts should be different from the mana used in spells. Hera trailed off, still in disbelief. What was even more surprising was that Eugene hadn't verbally let out an incantation. An incantation was the trigger to activate a spell. Although high-ranking wizards could cast magic without incantations, you would need to verbalize it to trigger your magic if you hadn't reached that level. He was able to silently cast his first attempt at magic. Then, without dispelling it, he changed the mana into a different form. "Sir Eugene," Hira said with a gulp, "is this really your first time using magic?" "Why are you asking something like that all of a sudden?" Eugene asked in surprise. "You've arranged all this to surprise me, right? Have you been secretly practicing magic in your room?" "Today is my first time trying it." "That's impossible. Why would I come up with that sort of lie?" As he said this, Eugene began moving the magic missile back and forth. It might not be as strong as sword light, but he liked that it was able to move without any physical actions on his part. "Please summon a monster for me," Eugene requested. "Huh," Hira mumbled in incomprehension. "I'd like to check the power of my spell," Eugene offered in explanation. Hira hesitated before accepting. Okay. What type of monster do you need?" "A tough guy, please." "Then are you fine with a golem?" "There's a golem that I've just created, so I can summon it immediately without going to get a catalyst." "Yes, please." While chanting her summons, Hira raised her staff. A magic circle was created a little ways away, and mana began to flow into the circle. Before too long had passed, a large golem was summoned from the circle. Hira introduced it. The golem is made from carbrium. Even without it using any defensive techniques, any attacks against it will have their force scattered on impact. "Sounds great," Eugene said with a grin. After walking the golem over to stand in front of Eugene, Hira drew back. "Please attack it," she called out. "All right." As soon as he finished his reply, Eugene threw the magic missile. Bang, bang, bang. The golem collapsed backward.